Forget the screaming air raid sirens. Forget the maps of the Luftwaffe tracking across the English Channel. If you stood in the Prime Minister's study in December 1940, the most terrifying thing in the room wasn't a report on the Blitz. It was a ledger. Winston Churchill sits at his desk, the ash lengthening precariously on his cigar. He isn't looking at a battlefield. He's staring at a bank statement. The British Empire wasn't just fighting a war. It was managing a liquidation sale. Every shell fired, every gallon of fuel powering a Spitfire had to be bought with hard currency. To pay the Americans, Britain wasn't just dipping into savings. They were effectively pawning the family jewelry to pay the electric bill. The gold reserves were being physically crated up and shipped across the ocean just to keep the war machine running for a few more weeks. In the heavy silence of the room, Churchill drafts a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. It is 4,000 words long. History remembers it as a diplomatic masterpiece, a letter to a friend. But if you strip away the aristocratic language, it was the act of a desperate man standing at a loan shark's door, hat in hand. He knew that sending this document was an admission of total insolvency. Churchill thought he was asking a friend for a lifeline, but he was actually signing the first page of bankruptcy protection. To understand the magnitude of the collapse, you have to stop thinking of the British Empire as a political entity and start seeing it as a business, Great Britain Incorporated. Imagine a single conglomerate that holds the title deed to 25% of the Earth's surface. Before the first shot was fired, London wasn't just a capital city, it was the CEO of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, the absolute gold standard of trust. They controlled the shipping lanes, the rubber, the tin, and the diamonds. They owned the inventory, the distribution network, and the storefront. For a century, London was the world's banker. If a nation needed capital, they knocked on Britain's door. They were the landlord collecting rent on the sun that never set. But by 1940, the bank is burning down. The shift was brutal and instant. We go from the glittering arrogance of imperial jubilees to the hollow echo of empty vaults. The liquidity is gone. The assets are frozen. The most powerful company on earth is suddenly trying to fight a total war on a credit card that has just been declined. They had the largest market share in human history, but zero liquidity. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau. History paints them as saviors rushing to the rescue. But in the private offices of Washington, they operated like ruthless venture capitalists eyeing a distressed asset. They watched the stock price of Great Britain plummet and waited for the perfect moment to buy in. To these men, the British Empire wasn't a cousin to be saved. It was a closed-shop monopoly that blocked American goods. They saw a market that needed to be forcibly broken open. The American public was sold a gentle story, the famous garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your hose. It sounds like charity. But in the fine print of the State Department, this wasn't a gift. It was a predatory mortgage. Washington made a cold, calculated decision. They would keep the patient alive, but only on life support. They provided exactly enough steel and oil to keep London fighting, but never enough to let them remain an independent superpower. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a handshake. They needed Britain strong enough to bleed the Germans, but too weak to ever dictate terms again. The Americans didn't want to save the empire. They wanted to inherit its customers. Before the Americans would sign the checks, they demanded an audit. But this wasn't a standard review of the books. It was a financial strip search. Washington didn't trust that the British were truly broke. So, to prove their poverty, they were forced to slit the throat of their own economy. The target was the American Viscose Corporation, a massive rayon manufacturer owned by British interests. It was a crown jewel, a steady stream of income worth over $100 million. Secretary Morgenthau looked at this asset and gave a simple, brutal order. Sell it by Monday. Churchill was horrified. He pleaded with Washington. He explained that dumping a company of that size onto the market overnight would destroy its value. It was financial suicide. Morgenthau didn't blink. He didn't care about the market value. He cared about the power dynamic. The company was sold for half its worth. It was a fire sale. The British watched $50 million, money that could have bought battleships, evaporate into thin air just to satisfy American skepticism. It was the humiliation of a proud father forced to pawn his wedding ring for pennies, while the pawnbroker watched without a shred of pity. It wasn't a transaction. It was a forced liquidation to prove to the bank that they were truly destitute. The specific contract that sealed the empire's fate is known to history as the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. It sounds equitable. It was actually a robbery. Churchill was desperate for naval support, so he asked for 50 destroyers. But he didn't receive a fleet of modern warships. He got the contents of a naval junkyard. These were World War I relics, pulled out of mothballs, plagued by steering defects and corrosion. The price tag for this pile of scrap? The keys to the Western Hemisphere. In exchange for these 50 vessels, the United States demanded and received 99-year rent-free leases on British strategic bases stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia. If you looked at a map in 1940, you could see the colors changing. In a single afternoon, the strategic outposts of the Royal Navy became American property. The United States acquired an instant global military footprint for the cost of scrap metal. Britain was no longer the landlord of the Atlantic. They were now just tenants living in a basement apartment, dependent on the goodwill of the new owner. Britain traded a century of geopolitical dominance for 50 rusted ships that barely floated. If the Destroyers for Bases deal was the robbery, Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement was the murder weapon. The Americans slipped a condition into the contract that looked innocent on the surface. They demanded a commitment to free trade. It sounds noble, it sounds democratic, but to the British economists reading the fine print, it read like a death sentence. For decades, the empire survived on a system called imperial preference. Think of it as a massive, exclusive country club. If you were inside the empire, say Canada or Australia, you paid low dues and traded freely. If you were an outsider, like the United States, you faced a high wall of tariffs. This wall was the only thing protecting British manufacturers from being crushed by American industrial giants. Article 7 demanded that Britain tear down that wall. Washington wasn't just lending money. They were explicitly banning the British from favoring their own family. They were forcing the local grocer to unlock his doors and let the global superstore set up a kiosk right in the middle of his aisles. The British negotiators were trapped. If they refused, the supplies stopped, and Hitler won. If they signed, they guaranteed that once the smoke cleared, their economy would be swamped by cheap American goods they could never compete with. They signed. They had no choice. The Nazis were bombing the factories, but the Americans were dismantling the business model. August 1945. The ticker tape is still swirling in Times Square. The world is cheering the end of the greatest slaughter in human history. But inside the British Treasury, the champagne remained corked. President Truman didn't just end the war. He canceled the credit card. Without warning, the United States terminated Lend-Lease. It was brutal and instantaneous. Allied ships that were already at sea, their hulls heavy with wheat and meat destined for hungry British families, were radioed to turn around. The delivery trucks simply stopped halfway up the driveway and reversed. The account was closed. Britain, victorious and destitute, had to beg for a new loan just to keep bread on the shelves. Washington agreed, but they attached a tripwire to the money. They demanded that the British pound become fully convertible to US dollars. 1. It was a trap. As soon as the restrictions were lifted, the markets panicked. Everyone dumped their pounds to buy dollars. It was a classic run on the bank, but on a national scale. The British economy, already on its knees, collapsed into the crisis of 1947. They had defeated Hitler, but they couldn't defeat the interest rates. Peace didn't bring prosperity. It brought the foreclosure notice. By the 1950s, the transition was complete. The maps had been redrawn, but the real change was in the vault. We are often taught that the British Empire collapsed due to a sudden wave of moral awakening or inevitable revolutions. And while the flags changed, the colder reality is that the London office simply couldn't afford the overhead anymore. The garrisons, the fleets, the colonial administrations, they were no longer assets. They were red ink in a ledger that Washington now audited. The United States didn't just win a war. They secured the portfolio. America emerged from the smoke, holding the world's gold, operating the world's strategic bases, and dominating the world's markets. The pound sterling, once the undisputed king of global finance, was demoted to a junior clerk. The dollar sat on the throne. If you visualize the timeline, it looks less like the fall of Rome and more like a corporate restructuring. The old management was retired. The new CEO moved into the corner office. The British Empire wasn't conquered on the battlefield. It was acquired in a hostile takeover, stripped of its assets, and liquidated.